Good afternoon or good evening, everyone. I think we've almost gathered everyone. Where did Jim go? There's Jim. Okay. Anyway, Jim gets the throne. I'm Steve Aron. I'm the president and CEO of the Autry Museum of the American West, a post I've held, I guess, now for 8.5 months. And the place is still standing. Actually, though, I should say, I have a much longer history at the Autry Museum, dating back many decades now, that I had a split appointment for a long time between my career, which has spent the last several decades principally as a professor, a specialist in Western American history, so hence my connection to the Autry. I guess a professor at an institution in LA that after several decades now, I left, and I probably have been forgiven by one of our hosts tonight for being a professor at one of the institutions in LA that he doesn't favor. But I would say it's that institution in LA that is still in the NCAA tournament. Now I've probably lost the favor that I might have curried from one of our hosts. And I guess I would start by thanking our hosts tonight, Christina and Jim Parks, for opening up this home to us. They actually hosted a salon for us over the summer as well at their home in Santa Fe, which is also a treasure to be seen in terms of its collections. So we are on the Jim Parks tour, and Jim and Christina Parks' home tour of their art collection, and really is each house is really a revelation in terms of the collections that are housed here. Indeed, I feel like I sometimes talk about how with the Autry Museum, I want to emphasize what I call the view from here, or the view from here and now. But I think in taking our salons on the road, I learn something about taking the view from other places around the West as well, and how valuable that is to us at the Autry to sort of connect with people around the West. And I guess on this trip in particular, I feel like in the last day and a half, we've managed to go really to see 4 museums. The Herd, which was a revelation too. And today we also went to this was my younger son, who's a musician, said, and I think he did this mostly to sort of dig at me. He said, he was here a couple of weeks ago, and he said, you must go to the museum, the Musical Instrument Museum, because it's the best museum in the world. And we know that this is the best museum in the world. But I actually say it really was pretty amazing. It really is pretty amazing. But I feel like the other 2 museums that, as I said, that I've gotten on this trip is, one, I got to visit the home of Bob and Pat White, and that collection too, I was saying last night, it was hard to get my head around it because because it includes so many different things, but it's the Western Americana collections and the Native collections are truly splendid and spectacular, to say nothing of the cars. Or, for that matter, the Tom Mix memorabilia, and which I should say, we are featuring a Tom Mix, well, that's a tease for an upcoming gallery that we're doing at the Autry, Imagined West, in which a Tom Mix hat is the signature opening artifact. So that gives you more reason to come to LA and come to that gallery. But, as I said, let me extend thanks again to our hosts, Jim and Christina Parks, to our other trustees who are here tonight. Let's see, I see Colleen Lee and Tom Lee, and our chair of our board, David Cartwright. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you all for joining us for this Autry Salon, which I'm so delighted also that we have Matt Smith, one of our longtime Masters artists, with us tonight. This is this year, and it runs for another week, I guess, the show? The end of March. This is our 25th Masters of the American West exhibition. So we've reached the silver anniversary, but I like to say that we seek to be the gold standard in Western American art. And thanks to artists like Matt, I think we can reach for that I was going to say brass ring, but that completely ruins my silver and gold metaphor here. In any case, it's really a delight to welcome Matt and to welcome Amy Scott, our VP of which you'll get a further introduction from Jim Parks in a moment, and to thank all of you for joining us tonight for this Autry on the Road Salon. And without further ado, I guess I should introduce Jim Parks, our host, or one of our hosts tonight.
Thanks, Steve.
Wait. Well, I think you do because we're recording you for the web.
I do. I have to. Okay. Thank you. So my friend Matt, now actually, Steve actually covered a lot of the things I was going to talk about, like the Master Show and the fact that Matt was a longtime artist of the Master Show, and we've always we've always enjoyed and appreciated his appreciation. He's really one of the artists that I've collected. I think I've got about 22 Matt Smiths.
I didn't know that.
Because they're basically terrific gems of paintings, and I mean they really kind of bring this spirit of wherever he's painting. So if you look at the paintings here of the Southwest here in Arizona, they capture Arizona. I have several of his paintings in my home in Pebble Beach, and they capture the California coast dramatically. And so if I'd have to say he's truly made an impact on making my life enjoyable in terms of having something to appreciate. And so thank you, Matt, for coming here. Now, Matt, as we keep on mentioning the Master Show, which is a show that I'm a co-chair of. I've tried to not be a co-chair many years, but I keep on I keep on getting drafted, and it's I view it as one of the preeminent shows that basically highlights the art of the American West that's done today. And I might mention that I've got another great master artist sitting over there, Logan Haji, and he's used to me mispronouncing his name, so he's a and so I'm glad that you came too. So we have two master artists here today, but tonight's Matt's spotlight. And so Amy Scott, who's our executive vice president, and she's got a real fancy title, of research and interpretation. It is, that's a big title. So Amy and Matt are going to have a nice little conversation where we're going to talk about a number of compelling and interesting subject matters. So here we go.
Excellent.
Now you're
okay.
mic'd up.
I think I'm mic'd up.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Steve and Jim and Christina and Jim Parks. It's wonderful to be here on the road, and it's always a great opportunity to talk with an artist in depth. At the Masters, it's a very busy weekend. The artists are around, but we don't always have the chance to look at their work closely, and we never or rarely have the chance, I think, to talk with them in depth about it. So this is a real treat. I have a few things to say about Matt also. I thought I would give you a little bit of his background, and then we'll get into some of the work. Matt was born in Kansas City. I spent time in Kansas City also, so we have that in common too.
Beautiful city.
It is. And when he was a young child, he moved here to Arizona, and it's here that he develops his lifelong connection to the Sonoran Desert, one that would eventually become the focus of his artistic career. As a child, Matt's family lived abroad in Toulouse, France, when he was 10, and again in France and Switzerland when he was a teenager. And it was during this time that he really was able to experience many of the world's great museums, and I think got his first taste of what great art really was. When he returned to Arizona, he entered ASU as a business major and came out with a fine arts degree. Frustrated with the focus on abstraction that was then dominant at many university art academies, Matt began looking to local sources for inspiration. And here in the burgeoning local art scene of Scottsdale and Phoenix, and in the nearby galleries, he discovered the work of artists such as James Reynolds and Clyde Aspivig, also two masters artists, and we're going to talk about them a little bit more also. Matt can often be found planting en plein air from here in southern Arizona to the Canadian Rockies, from California to Colorado, and has stated that he appreciates a traditional landscape painting and is inspired by the pristine landscapes of the American West. I enjoy working in areas where one can travel for miles without seeing the influence of man. When I paint, I feel I've hit the mark when I've captured a balance between mood, look, and feel. So as we look at Matt's work tonight, I think that's a really good framework to keep in mind. Equal parts look, mood, and feel. Let's see. And to start that out, we have a little video of Matt at work. Thank you for sharing that with us. So I thought we would start with a little bit of family background. And you can see Matt grew up in a family of four, I believe family of four kids. And it was a pretty adventuresome family. In addition to Europe, you were on the road a lot of outdoor adventures. Here it looks like some family rafting trips. And you grew up in the outdoors. You can see Matt is right there, future famous artist on the far left, and I believe he is on the right.
Is that on my name tag?
It should be. Current famous artist. So, beginning, at the beginning, these outdoor adventures, did that have an impact on you? And
It did. And first, let me say thank you for hosting us, Jim and Christine and Steve and you for the introduction. Yes, my father was... we relocated to Arizona because my parents got tired of the cold in Missouri, and my father got a job with Motorola. He ended up being an executive with Motorola, which is why we had the assignments in Europe. But he was a very outdoorsy, adventurous person, walks through the desert and that kind of thing. So we moved here when I was 3, so it's really all I ever knew. And none of this was developed out here. This was my roaming ground from here all the way down to Scottsdale Fashion Square. So those early expeditions and adventures they set the foundation for my life and my world. Yeah.
And so upon return from Europe, this is one of your earliest works, I should say.
One of my finest.
This is in his early abstract phase. You're about 4 years old here, and it's titled Creepy Guy. it looks to me more like a smashed spider.
I have no idea what that is.
That's the same thing.
So when Amy asked if I had any early drawings, I don't keep track of anything. I am the worst with that. So I went over to my parents' house and I said, "What do you have?" And they gave me boxes. And so I start rooting through these boxes. And most of it was my older sister because she was all smart and stuff. So, all her report cards. I didn't find one of my B-C report cards, which I found amusing. But I came across this, and this is where it all starts. I mean, every kid, have you ever sat a child down with a piece of paper and a crayon or a pencil or a pen and said, "Have at it"? I mean, the excitement level and the passion and the smile on their face is where it all starts. Somewhere that's beaten out of us in favor of reading, writing, arithmetic. But for those of us who held on to this and made something out of it, it's the foundation for it all. And as you can see, my titles were as good back then as they are now.
I can see it.
I'm the worst at titles.
It's got 2 eyes, horns, teeth,
Okay, you're
Creepy
big
guy.
hands.
yeah.
Yep. Well, I'm sure this is worth a lot of money right now. So
Oh, yeah.
I hope that you have held on to
It's
that,
available.
and that good, good to know.
You'll have to fight Cindy for that.
Moving ahead a little bit, when Matt was in college, obviously got very interested in some of the local art scenes and the cowboy galleries down in Scottsdale, and started out as a figure artist, actually. These images are copied from magazines,
Yeah,
if I'm
so-
not mistaken. The one on the left, to me, looks like Sam Elliott. And the one on the right is clearly the Marlboro Man.
Pulled from magazines. So my parents were art collectors, and not big time, but they brought home some pretty interesting stuff. One of the early pieces was a George Carlson bronze, which sort of set the foundation. My mother was she started as an art major, but didn't think she was good enough, so she went into art history. And so it was always there. It was kind of always bubbling up. But one of the artists they collected around the time I was about 14 years old was Paul Pletka, if you know his work. And I loved his work. They bought this beautiful drawing of his that I have to this day that is, from a craftsmanship standpoint, it's just spectacular, but it was kind of wildly exaggerated, big hands and that kind of thing. And I was blown away by this guy. So I started sort of imitating that. This is, again, 14, 15. Later, when we came back to Phoenix and I was introduced to the Cowboy Artists America at the Phoenix Art Museum show, I thought, well, I want to be a cowboy artist. So I knew nothing about cowboys other than westerns and magazines. So these were probably about the time I was late teens, early 20s. I would just sort of copy these things out of magazines. And then when I was in college, I had the opportunity to go over to Phoenix College where Merrill Mahaffey was teaching a class when he lived here. And I wanted to hook up with him over there because he was more of a traditional painter. And he hired me to work as an assistant in his studio, which I thought was the neatest thing. So he's looking at these things and he says, "Matt, do you really want to be a cowboy painter?" I said, yeah, I want to be like Frank McCarthy and Tom Lovell and these guys. He says, "Well, I have connections from my family background in Grand Junction, Colorado. I can hook you up on a ranch, and I will make sure you can work on one of these ranches for the summer." And well, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be a cowboy. I just want to paint cowboy. Like that. That was over. And so I was focused to really kind of analyze who I was and what I did and where I was every day. And it was always outside, roaming the desert. And so that's when I morphed into that direction.
I think you've already answered this to some extent, but I was going to ask you what it was about the sort of the cowboy image or lifestyle that drew you in, that you found alluring and sort of seductive as a young artist. Obviously, not something you wanted to do day in, day out, but what was it about sort of the cowboy image and the romance, I think, that we still associate with that kind of life?
It was the romance of it, the spirit of the West, these people who sort of conquered the land but were stewards of the land at the same time. Seeing that that level of craftsmanship in a show, traditional art, having access to it in the galleries in Scottsdale, which was a great thing. Boy, was that phenomenal. And just being out in the landscape and living the life in the land and earning a living off of it, to me, it was very exciting.
And you're here in Arizona, at a time when the cowboy artists are really at their, they're really at their high, they're really at their strength. I mean, they have some of the greatest members, some of the greatest cowboy painters of the 20th century are members of the cowboy artists, including our friend James Reynolds. Here on the left, and the picture on the right is actually an Autry Collections painting that was purchased out of Masters. I think Jim has been gone for about 10 years now, but he was really a focal point of the Masters for a long, long time. So I thought we'd look at some of these artists that have influenced you and talk specifically about what it is in that artist that you drew from. And if you can take yourself back again to when you are in the galleries and you're still a young artist and you're encountering Jim Reynolds or Clyde Aspivig for the first time, what is it specifically about that artist that had such an impact?
So early on, Wilson Hurley was a big influence. James Bama was a big influence. More the sort of very representational, almost photorealistic artist. When I saw Jim Reynolds work for the first time, and he was celebrating a medium and craft as much as he was the subject, that just blew me away. About the same time, I personally discovered Edgar Payne's work, who was the same way, his brushwork almost looked like Band-Aids laid out on a canvas with these subtle value and color changes that defined what was going on. It was brilliant. It was passion. It was, again, about the medium. So while I was at ASU, Jim Reynolds was teaching a workshop at Scottsdale Artist School, and I decided to go take that. That changed everything. 1 week with this guy blew away. Well, it took me 5.5 years because I kept dropping classes and getting C's because I was a traditional painter in a world of conceptual and abstract stuff. So I went to my teachers, and two of them said, "If you're not here, you're gonna lose a grade for unexcused absences." And two of them said, "Great, do it." And it was one of the smartest moves. At the end of that class, and I was probably the worst student in the class. I had no idea what I was doing. Jim took my pad of paper and wrote his phone number on there and said, "If you ever need anything, call me, but don't share this number with anybody." So it was 5 years before I had the nerve to call him, and he said, "I'm coming down to O'Brien's to drop off paintings. I'll come by your house." Well, I was embarrassed, Cindy and I had this little tiny house. He pulls up in his Ferrari.
He's a tall guy, too,
Yeah,
right?
he is a big guy. And it was great. I mean, he was so open and honest and spent at least 2 hours at the studio. But he opened my eyes in his work, and through our conversation, we became pretty close friends. He was a superb designer, a master colorist, expressive on a grand level, and he was just great. And shortly after I met Jim, I met Clyde Aspivig, and Clyde Aspivig was more of a naturalist, which kind of went in line with some of the more realistic work I was looking at. And at the same time, I met Lynn Schmiel, who was a supreme designer.
We have slides of Len and Clyde in a second, but before we get to that, I want to point something about Jim Reynolds' work here. And I think, obviously, the cowboy subject matter was really interesting to you at the time, and I think he really sort of captures that kind of lifestyle, the romance of what we expect the cowboy lifestyle to be. It's sort of, in harmony with the landscape. It's relatively isolated. It's rugged. It's masculine. At the same time, Reynolds was as good a landscape painter, which is, of course, the direction that you eventually took, as he was a figurative and an animal painter. And having been around a while from myself, those two things don't always, or even often, I think, really exist in equal measure in somebody's work. So the landscape quality of Reynolds' work, I think, is as much or is as significant as the subject. And the nocturne, which is the Autry painting on the right, nocturnes are just incredibly difficult to pull off. They're kind of the genre within American art in and of themselves. And something about the moonlight and the tonalist and the very sort of subtle values that you have to do within a landscape, within a nocturne specifically, is amazing. So on to landscape. These are three of your favorite landscape artists, each a very different kind of painter. And I thought we could maybe talk a little bit about these guys.
Sure. So Len Schmill's work I saw in the Bill Bishop Gallery down in Scottsdale, if you remember that. Well, he goes back to Kansas City, and my parents were buying antiques from him when he lived in his parents' attic in Kansas City. So when we came out here, I'd go into that gallery, and that's where I was introduced to Len Schmill's work, who has a great design sense, doesn't want to be cookie cutter, and he has a very unique way of seeing things. And he probably more than anybody opened my eyes to the Sonoran Desert and how beautiful it was. Cindy and I had a house together. This was in the mid '80s. And we wanted to sell it. I wanted to move to somewhere obvious, like Montana or Wyoming, where the peaks are sculpted, the trees are dark, the willow is one color, instead of a landscape where everything was like a bowl of steam, coming off soup or something. But the market wasn't good, so we didn't. And that's when I saw a Len Schmill painting of a barrel cactus and a few plants, and I could identify every one of those plants. And it's what I had experienced on a daily walk my entire life. And it was like he hit me upside the head and said, paint your world. And so I hunkered down, and I did, and that's when things started rolling. About the same time, I met Clyde Aspavig, and I liked his naturalist approach to the landscape. Not owned by the subject, he was able to depart and play with the texture and the variation, the underlying design. And right after that, I met Michael Lynch, who opened my eyes to the beauty of just a lyrical brushstroke at the expense of whatever it represented, and how that can come and go. In one moment you see the road, the next you see this beautiful lyrical stroke of paint. And so these four artists who I had access to in Scottsdale in the galleries became so important to how I grew as an artist. We didn't have the internet back there, so I'd go to the local library and check out every periodical, every book, and just go through it hours on end. Now, with the internet, you Google Edgar Payne and hit enter, and you have 500 high-color, beautiful images that fast. So I had to work for it, and I'm glad I did, because that's sort of how I grew into who I am.
One of the things you said about Michael's work when we were talking that I remembered is that it was like calligraphy to you, in which sort of every brushstroke is its own form, it's his own design to it, it has its own sort of life to it. Can you talk a little bit more about that relative to that painting? Because I think that's an interesting idea and one that might not be necessarily obvious to a lot of us.
Sure. If you're going to try to imitate an artist, you're not capitalizing on who and what you are, your own DNA, your own thumbprint. But when you sit down to write a note, like Carlson says in Guide to Landscape Painting, you're not thinking about your penmanship, you're thinking about the idea. Well, Mike, when I watched him paint, I mean, it was like a director of an orchestra. And what he did, if you look at the drawing in this road and how he pushes up into the paint to get that silhouette of the tree against the skyline, I mean, it's unique and different. And I always thought you pulled paint off a brush. Well, this guy's laying it down and pushing into it and doing all this. So that surface quality that you end up with when you get this close to a painting is as interesting as the design and that which it represents from across the room. And to me, that's so important in what I'm trying to do. I don't take it to the extent he does. I'm not as representational as Clyde, I don't think, but somewhere in all that, you'll find who you are. And so I think it's important to pull from a variety of different influences, which I did. And the reason I'm showing contemporary artists is, again, they were front and center in the galleries. I didn't have access to the museums. I couldn't afford to go anywhere. Yet I was so excited and happy to be a painter and go out in the desert. I never took a camera with me. I'd just go out and I'd finish these paintings as much as possible in case I didn't use them as reference and wanted to put them out, place them in the galleries. So I just go back the next day, and that worked for me.
The design elements of lens painting, I think, are also fairly extraordinary. I mean, it's basically just, 3 vertical lines that somehow create an image once you start to look at it, especially from a distance with no horizon, which is usually a very standard sort of marker of any given landscape painting.
Yep.
And then Aspavig, when you were talking about Aspavig, you used the word naturalism a couple of times. And can you talk a little bit about what that means to you and how you differentiate it from realism? Because I think a lot of people have a hard time sort of distinguishing or really understanding what the difference is between the two, especially from the artist's standpoint.
Well, to many of us, we associate realism with photography, which is what we think is a visual truth. That's why a lot of folks say, well, it looks just like a photograph. Well, we don't want it to look like a photograph. We want it to feel like what it is we're painting. Clyde was able to really pay respect to the subject, but at the same time, he layers his paint even more so now, and he too had calligraphy in his paint and the way he applied it and the way he layered it. His sense of broken color is just absolutely extraordinary. And to me, I found it, I don't want to mention names, but some of the previous names I mentioned as influences didn't interest me nearly as much as what he was doing. That's just me, but that's sort of how I developed out of all this. To this day, I think he's just an incredible, one of the best landscape painters out there.
Agreed.
And a big influence.
Now we're getting into your backyard. So we're shifting now from some of the artists that have influenced you to places that have influenced you and where your career has really sort of developed. And obviously the Sonoran Desert is front and center of that story. So after college, you and Cindy marry and you buy a little house in Phoenix and you start spending more and more time in the desert. But the desert is not like many other Western landscapes, especially ones that were probably hanging in the galleries that you were visiting or frequenting. So, and the Sonoran Desert in particular is, to those of us who don't look at it from the perspective of an artist, it's kind of the same. It's got a sameness to it from a lot of different perspectives. It's rocks and hills and cactus and more rocks and hills
fuzzy
and cactus
plants.
and fuzzy plants. But for you, it seems to be this place of just, infinite variety and, boundless interest. So what do you see in the desert that others do not? And how has this place taught you? Or what has this place taught you?
That's a great question. So I don't know if any of you saw the Zorn show in San Francisco a few years back. There was a painting of a gentleman smoking a cigar and the smoke's coming off, and there was a little placard under there, and it was one of his instructors, and it said, "There's form in everything, gentlemen, even smoke." And bam, that's the Sonoran Desert right there. So I'm looking for a place to live where the peaks are sculpted and the pine trees are dark and you can see the silhouettes and everything is clear and obvious. That's the underlying form of everything we paint. In the Sonoran Desert, everything morphs into everything else. You can't tell a Palo Verde from a mesquite, from an ironwood. They're all just soft and edgy, and every now and then is a swirl sticking out, and it's just chaos. That very thing I was running from was the thing that really helped me to understand form and how to see form. So when you look at a Palo Verde tree, I'm looking at them out here, you barely see an edge to them. The silhouette is so fuzzy, it's lost. But I had to realize it's a circle in a two-dimensional shape, it's a sphere in a three-dimensional shape, and then the character of the silhouette. And if you can get that, you have a Palo Verde bush. Now the detail is just something you throw on top. So no matter where I went in the country, it forced me to understand the underlying form of what I'm painting. And that to me was so important. And the connection to the Sonoran Desert was already there. Are you aware this is the lushest desert in the world in terms of plant and animal life? It's the richest desert out there. I mean, look at it. And if you get out and get outside the city limits a little bit into the raw, untouched desert, it's an extraordinary ecosystem. And to this day, it excites me. I was out painting the other day, and I felt like I was a kid in a candy store. And I've done it 5,000 times.
Well, I was going to say, one of the things that's remarkable about your desert paintings is that they all look fairly different. And so this, I believe, is the photograph on the left. And then is that the photograph on the left?
Oh,
And the
yeah,
two
that's
paintings that look like they may have been based sort of on this.
This is a
same set
photograph
plan.
on the left.
Yeah.
And this is a hard to get to location, a very unusual angle on Weaver's Needle, and how rich and lush and just how beautiful it is. Sometimes we need to see it in photographs because, like I said earlier, it's the visual truths for some of it. This painting was done in Superior. Just that area burned last year. I don't know if you know that, but. Beautiful area, and just a couple of swirls silhouetted at sunset. They're icons of the Sonoran Desert, iconic symbols. So I try to paint them. They're like people, Some of them are more interesting than others visually, but that grouping I thought was pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm. I like this series because you can see the photographic, you can see the photographic truth, or as you put it, of the landscape in that image. And then as you go to the right, you sort of see the poetry of the same place, I think, through your eyes. We have a few more desert paintings here. Similar thing going on. How is it that, so when you're going out and you're looking in the desert, again, everything looks kind of the same. How is it that what is it that you see in a certain place that makes you say, oh, I've got to paint that?
I never know, and that's a really great question, because when I go outside with a preconceived idea of what I want to paint, I drive around all day looking for the perfect version of that idea. If I go out with an open mind and first thing that stops me, I'm likely to paint something that I've never painted or considered before. And so that's what I try to do. But generally I'm looking for contrast, with whether it be color or value, large, simple shapes that will be the basis for a solid design. You never know. And it's the same thing no matter where I go, no matter what I paint. In this painting, I was taken by the balance of that rock formation and the swirl. Obviously, the swirl is a focal point, and that dark shadow on the left side of it just caught my eye, and I thought, I'm gonna chase that, see what I can come up with. The whole peak coming sweeping down into that swirl. And that was an on the spot or on the Peralta Trail in Apache Junction area.
Because light is so important in your work, and it's so important in the desert generally. Obviously, a setting can have a very different character at high noon than it does at early evening. Is there a favorite time of the day to paint, or is there a specific kind of light that you look for or enjoy more?
Anytime. The winter light out here is good. Sunrise to sundown, noon up, you'll have long shadows and warm light because the sun's so far south in the sky. So I like that because there's no downtime. So I go out and I'm painting all day. If I go up to Montana in the summer, there's a window of time from about 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. where it's just flat as can be. And you feel like you're just sort of wasting your time.
Now, these are both also desert paintings, am I right?
Yeah, so the one on the left, actually, Walter Mattia has that painting. That was in the Scottsdale Preserve right over here. Just of an old dead saguaro and a young one coming up, and I just love that sort of resurgence thing that was going on.
Well, the one on the left I actually wanted to ask you a little bit more about, because it's such a different kind of composition than the few that we've been looking at and some of the others that we're going to. You've got that, big, strong cactus, basically, or the tree that's dead, and it is just sort of going into the distance. It's a sharp diagonal, but it occupies the vast majority of the painting. And again, another sort of thing that if we stumbled across it, we would probably just step over it. It's not something visually interesting, I think, to the untrained eye. So what are you doing here? Are you playing around? Are you experimenting? I mean, why these choices as opposed to the more standard or traditional take that we're used to seeing from you?
One of the things I found out about Sonoran Desert is if you pay attention to what's at your feet, it's all interesting because the plant life is so unusual out here. What that is a dead sorrel that has fallen, and the young sorrel coming up from there. And just sort of that abstract nature of those, the trunk of the sorrel, which is actually a tree because of the wood structure coming at you, and the perspective on that was interesting, and just that little guy popping up. I thought that was really, really interesting and exciting. It would be a great subject. Now, the funny story about this painting on the right. So I discover a lot of the places I paint on Google Earth. If I see a canyon, I'll think, well, I wonder where that goes. I'll go home and I'll look. 4 miles in, you figure you're in something great. This is an area known as Bulldog Canyon in Amory. This is where it is. So I've got this little machine I go back on, and this is about 8 miles in on some of the roughest four-wheel drive trails ever. And I thought, I want to see how far I can go back, because this wash drops out in Sorrel Lake. And I thought, you're going to be 3 miles from the lake. So we get back there. Cindy's with me. I think she thought I was crazy. And I set up to paint. And everybody went for a walk, and I'm painting. And all of a sudden, I hear these voices coming from the lake. And it was this young guy and a gal, and the guy's drinking a beer. And I'm like, what? And they walk by like, a guy painting in the middle of nowhere is something you see all the time. And I said, hey, where are you guys coming from? They said, well, we kayaked across the lake. And I said, well, how far is the lake? I thought it was miles. And he said, about half a beer. So it got that far back in there, but that's a little painting. All these sketches have a story, you remember what happens.
Now, these are some of your fellow artists, including Ralph Oberg, and Skip Whitcomb, I think, is in this picture. Mm-hmm. And I know there's little pack trips and things happen all the time where artists get together and they go out and sometimes, deep into certain landscapes. And I wanted to ask about that. What is the reason for that, other than just fun and camaraderie and, people to hang out with and
well, that's
that
the main
kind of thing?
thing.
Do you critique each other's work?
Oh, yeah.
Is it cool?
In a brutal way. Especially if they're not there. You're in trouble if you're not there, Logan. No, it's just nice to get together. We work in relative isolation, so when you get together with other artists and you share ideas and concepts and what's going on and what's happening out in the art world, it's really, really helpful. So that's Ralph Oberg on the left, Dan Young, and Skip Whitcomb. We did a group retrospective show at the Steamboat Art Museum a couple years ago, and they came down here to paint for that show. And it's funny how crowded my house gets during the winter months with artists who are tired of the winter cold.
Yeah.
And so, I think it's really important. If you look at art associations throughout history, the California Painters, the Taos Painters, they rise collectively because of their shared interest and knowledge in what they throw around with one another. And so I think it's really important. Otherwise, like I say, you're alone. It's me and the coyotes out in the desert, occasional rattlesnake or something. So it's nice to have that communication with others.
Is there something that happens to your work when these other artists are around that wouldn't otherwise?
Not necessarily. I mean, they might force you to think of something in a different way. I think Skip Whitcomb is a genius. He's one of the best painters out there. And he, like Lynn Schmiel, has a very interesting way in seeing the abstract foundation of what's in front of him, whereas I'm seeing more the traditional elements. So when you hang with somebody like that enough, eventually they force you to think along those lines and study that and try to apply it to your work. And so I think there is value with that.
Now, speaking of, now we're going to get on the road and we're going to move beyond Arizona into Colorado, which is such a very different kind of landscape. And I wonder if you can talk about some of your favorite spots in Colorado and what it is that you appreciate about that landscape as opposed to the desert.
It's so different. It's there's so much more going on. The topography, water everywhere, the fall color, which we don't see here. Yeah, fall color here is January. Late December, January. So I like to send that to my friends when it's long gone for them. So in Ralph Oberg, this is in southwestern Colorado around Telluride, Ouray. It's in the San Juans. It's just a beautiful area to paint. And Cindy and I are going up there here on Sunday and going to try to capture some snow while it's a little bit warm now. But it's just it's nice to get into a landscape that sort of shocks you out of what you're used to and keeps you trying different things and looking at things differently. And Colorado certainly does that for me.
And speaking of Colorado, here we have two snowy Colorado landscapes. And these strike me as interesting because of the temperature. Mm-hmm. And these paintings are obviously very, very cool as opposed to the warmth and sort of the heat, even in the early morning of the Sonoran Desert paintings. Yep. How is it? How is that achieved? And because temperature, other than through color, is not a physical thing. So how is it that you are able to? How is it that you pull that off, especially in a place like Colorado, when you were so accustomed to working in a place like Arizona?
Actually, cold weather has a look to it. Things are much clearer. Things are much cleaner. If you look at, you know who Arthur Streeton is, Australian painter. If you look at those Australian painters, their paintings are very high key, narrow value range, color clicks, because they're painting the heat out there, and you can really see it in their paintings. You get up here where things are so clean, especially at elevation when there's a lot of snow on the ground and it's clean the air out. It's a different look. But I've always enjoyed painting snow because it's not a daily thing for me. Again, it's something unique and different, and I love to get up there and just try to play with it. And snow, unlike other elements, is highly reflective. It's just ice crystals. So every little color, every little thing reflects off of the snow, whereas sand or dirt absorbs light. So to try to capture that, what's happening in form as it rolls over is a real challenge. If you want to understand form, and that's just the shape of something, go paint snow on a sunny day. I mean, you'll see every color and a shadow you can think of. Greens and violets and blues and reds and orange, but they're so close in value in a narrow color range that they still fit into that one simple shape.
Yeah, I
Like
think you can see that. I was going to say exactly. You can
foreground
see
right
that
there.
in the lower left painting of the painting on the right, which is just, there's a myriad of colors in there. Blues, grays, white, pinks, some yellows, I think. It's really, if you can just look up close at that particular section of the painting, it's poetry.
It's always challenging to paint that, and it's really exciting. It is.
Okay, we're moving into the Sierras now. Another, I think, one of your favorite landscapes, and here you are with a bunch of friends. If you want to talk about, the Sierras is an interesting landscape, one we see often at Masters, but it always looks somewhat different, and it has this combination of like extreme elevation, snow, sunlight, and then these sort of crystal blue kinds of lakes that often appear in the foreground. And what is it about that combination that seems to draw artists in? It seems to be a landscape in a lot of ways that offers many things.
Yeah, it is varied. It's one of the most beautiful places, and it's relatively small compared to the Absaroka Beartooths or areas up the Wind Rivers up in Wyoming. These were the result of a horseback trip. This was on a horseback trip with friends where they take us in, drop us off for a week, and we just wander around and paint. I like this in the Sierra because we can hike out to do what we do. In the Wind Rivers, we get on our horses and ride for 2 hours and then paint and then ride back for 2 hours. I much prefer this, and it's such a concentrated, beautiful area up around Mammoth and Bishop and all that. That it's just a magical place. This painting on the left for me was fairly large. It was a 40 by 36. But that little pool was below Iceberg Lake, which was the main lake, but that thing was just jewel-like. It was unreal. And from a guy coming from Arizona in 110 degrees, I'm just looking at that thinking, this is incredible. And then this was, the one in the middle was a hike we did to sort of get acclimated for this ride in, because that camp was at 11,000 feet, and so that these are both studio pieces from studies that we did when we were out there. And then once we were here, we painted all day, hired a cook to cook us meals, and it's just a great way to go, and just a beautiful, wild area that's accessible.
Now, are there lessons learned from the desert that show up in paintings like this?
Always, and again, it comes down to the form. If I can simplify things down into their basic shapes and see that underlying structure of 4 to 5 main shapes, then I'm much more likely to get a decent design. If you chase every little thing, then you're done before you even start. So a big part of painting is what you're throwing out, taking this and this and I don't need that, I don't want this, I'm going to group these together. And that's half the fun of it, making it your own. instead of being owned by your subject. I have friends that I paint with, they'll come up behind me and look at my painting and say, what are you even looking at? That tree, that rock, that peak, and that water feature, and I pulled them all together. A month later, they'll be in my studio and said, oh, you reworked that. I said, I didn't touch it. You just don't have a point of comparison anymore. So it's all, the art is in the artist and their mind and how they perceive this information, how they want to edit it and play other things up. It's your story, so make it a story, instead of being owned by it.
The eye is the filter.
Exactly.
And
that's
then the
just
hand
sending
is the
information
tool.
to the brain, which is saying, yeah.
And speaking of, iconic landscapes and filtering your subject matter, I think Yellowstone is probably one of the best known landscapes in the world. Certainly one of the best known landscapes in American art. And painting here, I believe that's at the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone on
It
the right.
is.
The painting
That's
that's sitting
Lower
on the
Falls
easel.
there. Yep.
Yep. So that, of course, is an incredibly consequential landscape in American art. As you well know, it was made famous by Thomas Moran in a massive painting from 1872 that had a major role in convincing Congress to create the very first national park in the world. Now, when you're painting a landscape like that has all of this cultural weight and all of these, sort of significant art historical representations of it, does that weigh on you when you're painting it? Do you feel some sort of, is there a burden that comes with trying to paint a landscape that is already iconic? Or is that just out of your mind?
First of all, I'm not going to one-up Thomas Moran. So that given, I don't worry about it. I just go out and I paint my interpretation of it. Certainly it kind of floats around there, that great history. When we lived in France, I got a National Geographic issue for the 100th anniversary, or was it the 150? It was 72. 100th anniversary of Yellowstone, and there was a picture of the falls in there, and I thought, holy cow, does a place like that exist? So every time I go there, that's my favorite place in the park. And I jump the fence and go where I'm not supposed to go, and I go set up where nobody can see me, and I just decompress and paint. And that's one of the paintings I did on location there, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago. And then something less dramatic, which is still, to me, equally as beautiful, just a quiet little creek that you could easily see a fly fisherman taking advantage of and just setting up and painting that.
Of course, that's one of the things that makes Yellowstone so great. It's so varied.
It is.
You're in the Grand Canyon, and then you're in the woods and in the stream, and then you're in the what is the crystallized mammoth the hot springs.
Yeah, the geothermal features.
Geothermal
and,
stuff. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's a.
Have you ever tried to paint that?
I have. Oh yeah,
Like
you have to.
Yeah.
It's like that painting of the lake. The funny thing is, on those, is you're kind of looking down into them, and so trying to bring them up more at an eye level, like you say, to get a horizon line in there can be interesting.
Yeah.
You got to sort of condense things. But anyway, it's a national treasure, a great park, and favorite destination.
Another Glacier. I love this photo on the right. This is like Find the Artist. It's sort of like, where's Waldo? Where's Matt? And I think also that shows, you must have, I don't know how you got up there.
It was a trick.
But it shows, how sort of deep, physically into some of these landscapes you actually get. Do you have painting stuff on you? Are you going to paint something
Oh yeah,
up
I'm
there?
standing there painting. I should include the painting I did, because I had that. I was out for an event with the Plein Air Painters of America, and the road's up here, and I had my pack on. I was walking down, there's another painter painting. He said, don't go down there. A bear just went across the creek there, and I thought, really? That thing's kind of raging. Are you sure? Yeah. So I thought, well, I'll just go and I'll back up to the very edge, and if the bear comes, I'll just jump.
Good plan.
Yeah. The road's over here, and one of my friends took a picture of me. But it was. This is what right below Swift Current Lake, so it's one of those. I'm right there, all set up, and I had a great time. But by myself, this wild landscape. It's 128 degrees at home or whatever it is, and it's dramatic, and I just love that country. And then we went back in the fall, and that was a painting that resulted from that trip.
And that is what we have for you in terms of images. But we have more, I think. We have actual paintings. Matt's brought a number of original works here. And I thought we would look at two, and then there's more over on the table that you can look at to your heart's content after. But why don't we start with the desert? Why don't we start with the desert?
Okay.
And if you can just kind of walk us through how this comes to be, and try to bring us along with you, if you will. We're looking over your shoulder, all 30 of us.
Okay.
And how do you begin? Is there underdrawing?
Yes, I start with a simple line drawing, and my process is basically large to small. So I start with big shapes and then condense down. Dark to light, I start with the shadows and build up to the textural highlights, and thin to thick, which is a pretty traditional style for oil painting. The reason so many of my paintings are smaller, folks, is because I spend so much time outdoors. And it's probably been at an expense because I never developed my ability to paint really large paintings. I'm doing that more these days. The more you paint outside, the more you want to go indoors and just sort of decompress and go through the sort of more the academic approach of painting. The interesting thing about this painting is I was watching that moon rise over a period of days, and I timed it to go out there. I wanted to capture it right as it was coming up over these mountains, which are the Madazels. Four Peaks is over here. This is just right near my house. So I went out there and I sort of got the basic lay-in in terms of drawing of what I wanted to paint. And then I had about 15 or 20 minutes before the show was over. So I put it in a box, went home, ate dinner, went about my life. The next morning I pulled it out. So I had the foundation of this, I had a digital image that I could download on my computer right away in memory. And I finished this in the studio because of that. And it's one of the favorite paintings I've done of the Sonoran Desert because it employed everything I had at my disposal to make it happen. So it's kind of like the painting that will die with me. And it's valuable for other paintings, the relationship of a shadow versus highlight, warm versus some of the cooler notes, the warmth of those swirls and that sort of glowing light that's happening there.
And this very sort of impressionistic sort of light you have going on in the distance and behind the cactuses.
Yeah, I employ what's known as the velour effect for that. It's a relatively flat area of the painting, so alternating the brushwork there. So when you move it around in the light, the strokes of paint will catch the light differently, and so it gives it a bit of a vibrancy. Edgar Payne sort of played around with that idea quite a bit and altered the color too. This was an on-the-spotter completely, start to finish. On June 19th of 2011 in Yosemite on Father's Day week, don't ever do that. That was a mistake. So it was so crowded, I just sort of went off the side of this road about 150 yards and set up, and nobody was out there. And I saw this little black bear go across the road, and it caused a 45-minute traffic jam. And I'm over here peacefully painting this lost and found of this waterfall, and I'm watching this chaos of this traffic jam in one of our national parks. But I'll go and I'll paint, anywhere from 2 to 3 on a really busy day, 4 of these a day, and bring them home and use them as reference back in the studio. And I have piles of these things, and like these are some of the ones all these over here that I keep. They're worth more in terms of informing future paintings than the money I would get from them. So that's what I do.
The thing I love about this painting also is Yosemite, again, like Yellowstone, probably even more so, is one of the most painted landscapes in the world. It is. And the first time I saw this, I'm like, is that Yosemite? And then I didn't even recognize where. You have a way of sort of taking a new take on a landscape that is ages old and incredibly recognizable, and turning it into something that is completely your own.
Well, thank you. It's just trying to be myself. I'm not pushing it to try to imitate anybody else. I mean, certainly I'm influenced by different artists, and some are probably more obvious than others, but I still try to put my own twist on things. And, you can be a great artist, but you're not going to be the best artist you can be unless you get out and work from direct observation, at least occasionally. Jim Reynolds didn't work from life very often, but he would go outside into the landscape, and I would literally see that guy tear up with emotions from what he was doing. George Carlson doesn't paint the landscape, but he goes out with these color charts, and he's such a bright guy, and he's so analytical that it just burns in, and he remembers that stuff and takes it back into the studio. But the point is, they're connecting with their subject on a really deep level, and it pays off. And there's a richness to their work that you're not going to get if you're just kind of a drive-by painter shooting photographs. Plus, it's fun. What's a bumper sticker? A bad day fishing is better than a good day working or something? Insert outdoor painting in that, and you've got it.
Thank you for sharing all of this. This is an enormous treat.
Well, thank you, Amy.
And I think we have time for a few questions.
Oh, I've got one. What told you that you were not going to be a business major?
Funny story. I sold my first painting when I was right after I turned 17, and started with my first gallery when I was 18. But I never really thought you could really make a living at this. You gotta earn a living. And of course, my parents weren't real hot on the idea of me, getting an art degree. So one of my elective classes is a business major. Take what you want. So I went and took a beginning drawing class, and the teacher came up to me at the end of the class and said, "Can you kind of hang around? I want to talk to you a little bit." Uh-oh, what have I done? And she said, I don't see people with this skill level in these classes, and I didn't think I was any good. I just got a guy drawing, and she says, "You really need to think about going over to the art college," and then I did. I'll never forget my dad's face as an international businessman. You doing what? He's my biggest fan now.
I bet.
Yeah.
Well, thank goodness for that teacher.
Yes. Yeah. No kidding. I wish I remembered her name, and I don't. It was just one class.
Matt, I know you do a lot in the Sonoran Desert. What's your sense of the Grand Canyon as a place to paint?
It is absolutely beautiful. It is a grandiose and wildly complex. So one of the guys that helped me out early on was Kurt Walters when I was still in college, and would invite me up to paint. And I didn't want to paint that realistically, but I appreciated what he was doing. A master at it. But I have found that the areas, outer lying areas around the Grand Canyon, where Logan and Bo just had their paint out in Bluff, is every bit as dramatic. Plus, you can lock in on some of these simple shapes and kind of stay organized, which I need to make that work. And you guys ought to all go online and see this show they just put together that's opening tomorrow. Holy cow. Tim Watson, Lynch Mill, Logan. This guy is a hell of a landscape painter. Right?
Actually, I do have a couple.
You should.
Oh, I do.
Yeah.
That kind of leads to my comment, more than a question, I guess. But I was lucky enough when I was in art school, Matt came to town and taught a workshop at one of the schools I was studying at. I think it was like a 3 or 4 day workshop, and it was just super helpful for me. So I thought it'd be worth mentioning just what a great teacher Matt is, and I think you've made a huge impact. I hear from so many students that have passed through your workshops and classes and stuff. I feel like every friend I have artist friend has had a Matt Smith phase, But yeah, I mean, those simple, we paint very differently, but those simple principles you talk about with those major shapes and just looking for the simplicity in the landscape has stuck with me to this day. So I think it's just worth mentioning what a great teacher you are.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. As much as I'd like to take credit for your success, I'm not even going to go there. I think you were 21 in that class, were you? You were really young.
It was probably about 2001, yeah.
And he had these really insightful questions, and you could tell he was energetic. Anytime somebody that young takes a workshop, you know you've got something. And we crossed paths many times after that. It's been a real joy to watch your growth and development and what you become.
Well, thanks.
Sort of a national treasure in the
Thanks.
art
I don't
world.
mean the comments to come back towards me, but I just
Well, they're gonna.
no, but really, I think it's a big part of your legacy besides your art, which is obviously number one. But you've just made a huge impact on students. I think.
Well, that means a lot. I enjoy painting and sharing the knowledge that these guys were so free in handing to me. Even my father said, "I've never seen anything like this." In the business world, you don't share information like that with your competitor. You cut them out. He's like, because he met a lot of these guys. I can't believe you guys are sharing this. He said, "Dad, this is foundational stuff. This is, so that's fun." But I feel the need to pass it along.
So our country is filled with so many beautiful places, and you've hit all the top ones. Is there someplace else on planet Earth you would like to paint besides in this country?
I want to get back to the Alps. So I lived in just outside of Geneva, Switzerland for a year when I was 16, 17. Had the chance to visit Vermont. I've been back a couple times. But the last time was in the late 80s when I was sort of still in the really basic development stage. I'd like to go back now and really explore that country on a deeper level. People ask me all the time, what's your favorite place to paint? Wherever I am. You travel the Western United States, and it's such a diverse place, and there's so much to offer, and we have so many large open spaces that we can access without feeling threatened or we're invading somebody's space. And I love taking advantage of that. I travel around. This is over in, a lot of you are from California, this is outside of Palm Springs in Box Canyon. What a place. What a place. It's like the topography of Sonoran Desert without as much plant life. So you see the backbone of the landscape and the geology of what's going on. And this was on the way to the Autry show a couple of years ago. It was 96 degrees that day. It was in February. I'm like, I'm trying to get away from this. But pulled out the awning and had a good time. And one of the paintings I painted is right over there in Painted Canyon. So anywhere's good.
So please do take the opportunity to look at Matt's work in person, these paintings, and there are a few more sitting over on the table, including apparently the one that was made on that trip. And thank you so much for being here and for all of the support that you provide for the Autry and for Masters of the American West.
I'd just like to say one more thing. A quick story. Thank you to all you collectors. You are an important part of what's going on in the modern art movement. When we visited France, when we landed in Paris, I was 11. And the first thing we did was went to the Louvre. And I'm coming from Scottsdale, Arizona, an art town where it's just, I thought every town was an art town. We vacationed in Carmel, galleries. We vacationed in Santa Fe, galleries. I thought that was normal. So I knew about the art tradition in Europe, and we go, and I'm looking at the Louvre and these massive just paintings. We funnel out of the gallery and start walking these side streets, and I didn't see any galleries. And I remember thinking, when did they stop creating art in France? And they didn't. It just wasn't as available. But there seems to be a real interest in the American West and art of the West, and it wouldn't be happening on the scale that it is without the support of collectors. Same thing with film and music and literature and everything. So, you think I'm special. I'm just a guy making paintings who's thankful for folks like you who allow me to do this. You're an important part of the process and what's happening, and so I applaud you for that.
Mabel agreed.